Hey, what's up, everybody? Joe Moore here with Kyle Buller for Psychedelics today, Solidarity Fridays. Hope you're doing great. Before we kick off too much, reminder that September 23, we kick off Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. You can learn more at psychedelicstoday.com, and we'd love to have you. It's an 8-week program, 47 hours of material. We'll work you through 12 of which is live in class with us. If those dates don't work, we also have an independent learner group that you can take at a lesser rate, but with no kind of class time. Still a good 35 hours of material in there. And it's all designed to give you a solid foundation to help you decide where you want to go in your psychedelic career, journey, path, however you're looking at it. It's essentially what we wanted during our undergrads. Would have saved us a lot of time and headache. So that was our intention, and we've had well over 400 students through it at this point, and just can't wait to teach it more. We've also recently kicked off an Australian cohort, and that's been going amazingly as well. So, all right. And yeah, learn more, psychedelicstoday.com. If you want to leave us a small monthly donation of $2 or more, you can leave that at patreon.com/psychedelicstoday.
Sweet.
All right, cool, Kyle. So I think we have a few fun topics to talk about. Number one, what is healing? What is transpersonal? And what is spiritual emergence?
Yeah.
3 great topics for us.
Yeah, I think some of this started coming up in conversations recently, and this will be a little bit of a teaser, but I think it's kind of an extension. We just recorded an episode for a special 920 episode with Michelle, and some of these topics came up during that episode, and I guess, yeah, my brain is still spinning a little bit around these topics, so it might be fun to just kind of dig in a little bit around it. And this idea, like, what is healing?
Yeah.
You know, I think in the psychedelic community, the field, since it's so oriented, you know, towards mental health, and, you know, when we also think about some of the indigenous uses, obviously oriented around healing. But yeah, there's this narrative around psychedelics being healing. And, you know, I guess questioning that at times, and kind of taking a little bit of a pulse and, you know, do they always heal? And what does that even mean to heal? So, yeah, just some things that are kind of simmering in my mind. And, you know, we kind of talked about it a little bit with Michelle, but yeah, I mean, I've definitely had experiences like early on. Would I necessarily classify that as healing? You know, maybe long term, there were some healing benefits where, you know, it kind of helped me, I don't know, clear out some thought patterns or help to get me some perspective around things. But also kind of generally pretty weird. And also, you know, sometimes traumatic. And I think that's important to highlight at times, right? Especially when people are having these experiences with the intention, like, how do we support people that have had, you know, maybe traumatic experiences with psychedelics and necessarily didn't find healing in the experience? And I think that's...
Let's start with some definitions, maybe.
Yeah.
All right, so a couple. I think this is from Oxford Languages: healing, the process of making or becoming sound or healthy again, the gift of healing. Now, the Wikipedia one is interesting. Healing is the process of restoration of health from an unbalanced, diseased, damaged, or unvitalized organism. The profession of nursing has traditionally been concerned with matters of healing, whereas historically the profession of medicine has been concerned with curing. That's an interesting turn of phrase for Wikipedia. Yeah, how do you relate to those? Does those sound reasonable?
Yeah, I think so. I'm also here. I always like to look at etymology as well. So Old English, cure, save, make whole, sound, and well. And then there's a bunch others from German, Dutch, Gothic, Old Norse to make whole. I like that, actually. Kind of coming back to that word holotropic, moving in the direction of wholeness.
Yeah. It's nice to have it a little it's a little circular, but it's also, you know, reality is a little circular. So, the organism, you know, say age 7, you know, typically a human at age 7 is pretty healthy, right? Maybe some disorder comes up, and then we help them get back to that original state, roughly speaking, you know, through various means, either rest or, who knows what, making you drink a little bit of water because you're dehydrated, and then you can get back to your healthy function, right? Like, there's so many different systems at the micro and macro level in animal bodies, human bodies, that small things can really kick people in a weird direction, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, healing is just kind of restoring the state that feels good, I guess. You know, optimal, more normal functioning, as opposed to like, oh, your intestines leaking into your body, like maybe we need to sort that out. Same thing, you know, internal organ damage, we got to sort that out so the body can then heal.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe that's a good way of looking at it, right? Like, you're having the intervention, a massive intervention, and then you heal afterwards. Like, my tendons were so thrashed before a lot of my surgeries that I needed the surgery, and then I needed to heal. Yeah. The surgery wasn't the thing that triggered the healing, right? But it set up the initial conditions from which I could then heal. Right.
Yeah, it makes me think, too, about something Michael Mithofer said during like the MDMA training years and years ago. And I'm sure if you probably heard this before, but just this idea that, you know, when you get a deep cut and you need stitches, you know, the person doing the stitches is just creating that container for the body to heal itself, right? Like, the stitches aren't necessarily healing. It's just bringing the skin closer together to make that process easier. There's an innate wisdom within the body that knows how to, you know, heal itself. And I guess that's interesting to think about, like, physical healing versus healing from, say, like mental health disorders or something like that, right? Like, physical healing, we can really, I guess, kind of see and feel at times, where it's like, oh, okay, I have this cut, now it's starting to scab, now it's starting to scar up, it's healed, right? Versus like, yeah, I think maybe at times when it comes to mental health, it's like, well, what does healing mean when it comes to mental health, right? Because sometimes it gets worse before it gets a little better at times. People can have really big insights and feel this positive change in their mood and behavior, and then all of a sudden, you know, maybe that comes back again. And so I guess from that perspective, I see it as very circular, right? It's always in process, and maybe it's harder to really nail down, you know, what does it mean to heal a mental health disorder at times? I mean, you know, I guess we can look at scales and measures and, you know, quantify it that way and say, you know, your mood has been improving, but
right. And, you know, I like that surgical analogy I made earlier, and as it might relate to, like, let's see, yeah, like MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So we have, you know, the disordered state, the dis-ease state, disease state, and then we have to do a massive intervention, and then over time things might heal, right? So, you know, the whole protocol is really aggressive, really ambitious. And, you know, maybe this is another way to look at that integration term, right? We just want to set the stage so that people can heal, aka integrate or make meaning or whatever that is. You know, we've had a lot of problems with this integration term lately. You know, Aiza has this line about what integration being problematic for BIPOC folks, because that brings up stuff from the 60s and segregation. And it's a triggering word. So perhaps in certain populations we need to revisit that. Anyway, tangent. But healing. Yeah, so it takes a little while for the intervention to kind of cure up and solidify into the person's life, and they can go forward. But really, some people have a little cynicism around what is the psychedelic experience and is it actually healing? Can it heal? Can it cure then heal? Like back to that Wikipedia definition.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept, like you and I have seen harm from psychedelic experiences, but we've also seen pretty massive improvements in some people, right?
Yeah.
Largely it's all positive. Like I've seen much less negative than positive, even in recreational settings. Yeah. And even those people came out fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think generally we do see that positive shift, even when there has been a pretty, I guess, like significant difficult experience that arises. And it's interesting, too. I think I was just reading this article or skimming through it in Mad in America. I just saw somebody post it. But the author, I think, quoted Ben Sessa, Dr. Ben Sessa, talking, because I know he's used this phrasing, like MDMA as an antibiotic for, I forget how he says, like the soul or the mind or something like that. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to think about when, I mean, just talking about just thinking about like the integration phase and just thinking about people I've worked with in the past where these challenging experiences do come up and they question it, right? Of like, what was that? Was that necessarily healing? And then what happens when we talk about these healing experiences all the time and people don't receive that, right? It's like, right. Am I broken? This helped so many people, but it hasn't helped me. And yeah, I think it's just like a good conversation to start to think about as we move forward. And, more people are starting to help clients embody their experience. I like that word, embodiment, a little bit more lately. And yeah, how do we make meaning out of that and help people work through the experience if it was challenging? I'm just thinking about like my most challenging experience. It was definitely when I was 21, catapulted me in spiritual emergence. And I guess we'll dig into that a little bit more. But, I always question that. And that experience, I guess, really got me on the path. I was telling you a little bit earlier, Joe, near-death experience. I had this really profound experience at psilocybin. But it wasn't until I had that experience that it really got me down this path. And for a while, I regretted it, and I never thought I would ever touch a psychedelic ever again. It catapulted me into an experience that felt like it lasted 3 to 4 months. I didn't know what to do with it. There was so much regret around it of thinking, like, did I just fry my brain? Am I ever getting out of this? Is this my new sense of normal? Struggling with some HPPD, having a really hard time driving and having those visual aspects persist. Would I call that a healing experience? Not really. It was traumatizing, but thinking
it's more like a catalyst.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about it, and it took me 5 years to really process that experience. And it was a catalyst, right? It was a catalyst that got me more on this path. And so sometimes, we don't always see that right away, right? And I think maybe it's the culture that we live in, kind of like this instant gratification, like we need to, see it now. That's the way it's portrayed. You have this mystical experience and then you're just transformed instantly. But this was a much longer process that unfolded for me. And really kind of dragged me through the trenches at times. And it took me a really, really long time to I guess find meaning in that, and find a way to embody it. And actually, I think it was really around like changing the narrative of really seeing it as a catalyst and also as an initiatory crisis of some sort, where it was like that was the thing that really put me through the ringer, really was testing me. And it was, I might have shared this on the podcast before or in our class, but I mean, it was so basic, kind of dumb. I was taking this class on warriorship and studying Aikido and just some Shambhala text. But I came across this quote, and it just feels so cliche. But this was like the lightning strike that helped me make sense of that experience. Was, paraphrasing here, I don't remember it word by word, but it was like, life's like a tea bag. It seeps you in hot water to see how strong you really are. And I thought about that and said, that experience that really dragged me through the trenches, like that was testing me on a lot of different fronts. And I think this is where kind of like the transpersonal thinking comes in, right? Like, what higher thing is unfolding at times that's guiding us through life? Is there meaning behind some of the experiences that we go through? Or is it just in the human psyche that needs to make meaning out of it, and that's just what it is, right? And we just find ways to calm ourselves and make ourselves feel better over time.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot there, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Initiation, really means start, right? Initiate, start.
Yeah.
And then, it's starting. So catalyst, initiation, they all have slightly different terms, right? You throw pure sodium into the water. It's kind of like a catalyst for really, maybe the water's the catalyst. I don't know which one's the catalyst, but something is, and it does this huge explosion. And psychedelics in some ways really do trigger that big explosion that kicks things off in unknown directions. I think that's why Groff calls one of his books The Adventures of Self-Discovery. This is really a massive project to help you understand who you are, why you're here, what you're supposed to be doing, all this fun stuff. Really big existential, really important questions. And yeah, what do we do? How do we relate to that? Should we start? Ram Dass has this whole thing, like, don't really start a spiritual path unless you have an intention of finishing it. Which is really interesting. It's better to not have started than to start than quit. And I find that a little troubling and challenging, because how many people are smoking DMT these days or eating mushrooms these days, in a pretty intentional environment, but like aren't going to really keep on keeping on. But why is it a problem? Maybe. Why? Because you've detached from kind of consensus reality in a number of key ways. It could make you a more important asset to the world, but it also causes a lot of problems by, seeing things really clearly. The Matrix is a good analogy here, or Plato's analogy of the cave, or allegory of the cave. Yeah, like, you might get ridiculed for sharing your experiences. Thankfully, us and many other groups out there are trying to make these conversations accessible and available and reasonable to have, right?
Yeah.
We need this foundation. Otherwise, where are we going? What are we doing? Yeah. I don't know. Anything come up there for you?
Yeah, I mean, just that idea of like, I think it's important to be able to share a lot of this stuff, right? Even if it feels scary, and, something that I come back to often is like knowing your audience and how to share it. But, also as psychedelics and transpersonal experiences become, maybe more people are having them, through all these, as Stan would call, technologies of the sacred, psychedelics, breath work, having Kundalini awakenings, etc. I think there's still kind of a stigma and a taboo around these experiences as times. And how do you, I guess, like, talk about that? And I guess, like, something that comes up for me is just thinking about, like, some people I've chatted with reaching out for support, and sometimes it starts, I don't know if I can tell you this because it feels crazy or sounds crazy, even though they're reaching out for support for, that type of transpersonal experience. And so it's interesting that there's still that fear attached at times. So even just thinking about like, the allegory of the cave, like coming out and saying, like I see what's going on there, and everybody's looking around. They're like, what? And I think that's kind of embedded in us at times of how do we share these really profound experiences that don't always align with mainstream ways of knowing and thinking, can be really hard. And then when I think about like my healing process, going back to healing, was that it was really important to find a place to share that and to have a nice open space to explore it and ask a lot of these different questions. And I guess like, just have open dialogue around it. But,
Right. And is there something about a spiritual quest that heals? I think on a somewhat occasional basis, yes. But I don't really want to get explicit here. It feels like territory I'm not really prepped to discuss. But I think there's something there, right? Like intentionality and deep focus and reverence and the mystical experience, like as we've seen at the Hopkins trials, the higher the mystical experience on the MEQ, the more healing. So there seems to be a direct correlation there, some sort of correlation there. So it's interesting, right? And what do we do with that? I think this is what transpersonal psychology often covers, right? If you look at one of those textbooks for transpersonal psych, there's like chapters on all sorts of religious traditions.
Yeah. Religious traditions, and lots of variety of mystical experiences, shamanism, dreams, meditation, paranormal experiences, all sorts of stuff kind of falls within that transpersonal scope.
Right. Comparative religion even. I found that really helpful. So various kinds of pilgrimages, that's mindfulness with sacred sites. And, there's just so much here. It's really hard to pin it down into, something easy to understand in transpersonal psychology. But it's something worth digging into. One of the titles here in this Borstein textbook, Transpersonal Psychology, is The Story of Wendy, a case study in multimodality therapy, which I think is what we're looking at in the future, right? Like, should somebody exclusively do EMDR? Like, that doesn't really make sense, right? Like, we should probably do that in conjunction with a few other things.
We need lots of different tools, right? Some are going to work for some people, others aren't going to work. We need to be able to have all those tools in the toolbox.
Right. This is another interesting chapter, a shamanic Christian approach in psychotherapy. So, like, how do we make shamanism acceptable for this huge number of Christians or monotheists generally out there? I don't see it as being too much of a disjunction, but I see how a lot of people could be a little freaked out when we talk about entities that aren't part of, they aren't saints and they aren't angels or God, Yeah. So, and even death, like
it's a huge
thanatology,
topic.
the study of death. There's a lot here. Like, even just studying death can be transformative for us as individuals. At the least, make life feel more important because we only have it for a little while. Our friendships are quite transitory. And what do we do with that? How do we want to have those relationships knowing it's temporary?
Yeah.
And these things can be huge kicks in the ass for clients, for patients, for, people in coaching, all sorts of people trying to transform.
Yeah.
And maybe it's an interesting word to look at, right? Like, we always talk about transformation in this space. It's like we are trying to help people change towards what they want to be.
Yeah.
Or maybe what their body or soul wants them to become, right? And it's hard for that person before healing and before transformation to understand what that looks like. But in some ways, that is healing.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that kind of comes back to this, like, process-oriented approach of, like, thinking, right? Like, just really thinking about that process of transformation and healing and all the ups and downs that we go through with it. And so, yeah, I guess the point of this is just thinking about therapists or wellness practitioners, anybody that's like working in the space, and clients are coming to you, like, you know, with some of these more challenging experiences, just, you know, understanding that it's normal, right? I think to maybe not always feel healed, even though a lot of the mainstream articles are kind of portraying it as that. And I think that's a danger around not being, you know, honest about our own experiences and our own process, right? Is that just really putting out the highlights of the experience, and really just trying to be real and say, you know, there's some challenging stuff that comes up, and
Instagram curation of your psychedelic story.
Yeah, it's a thing, right? People really just want to highlight the peaks, but you know, there's a lot of juice in the valleys. There's a lot of good content there to work with. And then also on the other side, you know, if you personally have had an experience in the past and feel like you didn't really get benefit from it, also know that's normal and that's okay, right? And I don't think it necessarily always points to, you know, I'm broken or something's wrong. You know, how could we take more of a process-oriented approach and think about the long term, right? Like just thinking about this process that I went through. I mean, it took me like 5 years, and I did go through that thinking, like, what's wrong with me?
Right.
My brain's broken now. I'm never going to be the same. You know, how am I going to navigate through this? But, yeah, well, it comes back to this like interesting statement or question that I proposed a little bit earlier, Joe, when we were talking. What does it mean to live transpersonally or live a transpersonal life? And that was really part of the healing process for me. It was like trying to understand a new map, and really sticking with that process and, you know, reminding myself that this is a process and there isn't these like, you know, goals. I'm like, oh, I'm going to get better now. It's like, no, how do we become more fascinated around your own process? And I think that comes back to something like Arnold Mindell talks about in his process work. Like, how do we become so fascinated around our own process? And that's not to be like selfish or narcissistic, but like, you know, not giving up on yourself, like engaging in those practices, those narratives that keep you engaged, that keep you interested, that keep that fire inside of you alive, so you can continue to work with it, right? You know, sometimes it feels like that fire dies out when we're doing a lot of inner work at times, or, you know, life throws us upside down, and it's like, what is all this, you know? But how do we find some curiosity there as well to keep that fire going and keep that interest alive within us?
You know, being engaged in the process. We were also, as we were talking about, like, how do we live this, live transpersonally? We talked about Ken Wilber's work and his kind of like hierarchies, which are interesting. I don't really know what to do with them, but I often like to reflect on them, and becoming stable with the transpersonal awareness, you know, not being disturbed and freaked out by the transpersonal that's in your day-to-day, being able to sit with it and be okay that maybe you're seeing things that aren't, you know, normal humans, and like messages and all this other stuff, you know, like, how can you live in your day-to-day and still have that awareness? It's a lot. It's not an easy task.
No.
But it is something that happens for people. We've heard about it a lot, right? Like, you do, you know, drink ayahuasca once or 20 times, all of a sudden you're seeing energy everywhere. You don't know what to do with it. Like, that's a step in that direction. Once you can figure out how to get through your day to day while seeing all that, like, you're making progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's like where some of those like traditions are helpful, right? They provide some sort of map at times for people to maybe engage in their own narrative and their own process. At least it like can sometimes provide a language or a foundation to start to work with.
Yeah. Right. Because, you know, medicine doesn't really contain this very well yet. If you tell your doctor or therapist everything, there's a chance it might not go well for you, right? There's also a chance it is going to go well for you, but there's also a risk of disclosing this stuff. Like, I can still barely talk to my physicians about cannabis. Never mind everything else, right?
Yeah.
I need to work on that. That's my bad for not having one yet, that I can be honest and open with. But it's definitely a big deal. And yeah, the priests or the spiritual leaders or people who have at least been on the path for a while, whatever that is, they might be able to give you some great advice. Like, what was your line, Kyle? It's too bad, because if this happened to you in a certain indigenous settings, you would have been identified as having some sort of shamanic gift and taken under someone's tutelage for years and years, right? Something along those lines.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I had a teacher when I just shared my near-death experience and some of those earlier experiences with him. He just looked at me and said, it's a shame. If you grew up in a traditional culture, the elders would have stepped in and taught you this new way of seeing and being in the world. But unfortunately, you had to figure that out yourself. But you're here now, and you're showing up, and you're doing it. But it's not part of our culture, I guess, to really, I guess, embrace those experiences.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Because you can be deemed crazy, right? Or psychotic.
Hospitalized, forced medicalization, rights taken away, children taken away. There's, an endless list, right? And is this an actual disease? Maybe, maybe not. Is it best to, destroy a family for it? Probably not. But, we have a long way to go, right? Like, even a lot of these religious groups don't have places to help people go and be on retreat for a while. Like we talked about the Quakers having a lot of success with their facilities, but there's not too many others in other groups, right?
Right. And I guess what type of container do those places have? I'm just thinking, I think it might have been in the movie Crazy Wise, really great documentary about spiritual emergence. But one of the people that they're following in that episode had a spiritual emergence psychotic episode from a Vipassana retreat, and that's pretty common. I hear.
Actually, surprisingly common. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know somebody that got kicked out of they were living there for a bit, and once they started to have really big experiences, the community couldn't contain it, right? And so they had to ask that person to leave. So it's again, I guess even that romanticizing too, which we talked about on the 920 episode, maybe we could romanticize that, some of these traditions have containers, but, for this example, it didn't. They had to go somewhere else because the container wasn't there to hold that much energy, that type of experience, right? Probably thinking about the guests and everybody else that's joining there.
Right. And do you have enough extra staff to be able to help contain that? I think at most of the Dream Shadow events we do, if something came up, we always have extra help on hand, which makes it really special. But, are you planning for some sort of opening like that at a meditation or yoga or ayahuasca retreat? Like, maybe not. Maybe that person needs to be on, supervised timeout for a while.
Well, and that's tough too.
Really
just
comfortable.
Thinking about the retreat format, you can obviously support somebody while they're there, but what happens once they leave? And right. I think that's where people find themselves, I guess, in the deep water at times. Once they leave and that support's gone, they go back to their community and they don't have that support around, and they're just trying to stay above water with their experience. And then they're trying to reach out to a therapist or help, and people aren't, I guess, literate or have been, trained in this kind of transpersonal worldview, spiritual emergence worldview perspectives to be able to work through that with the person. Because it can also be scary, right? There definitely are some safety issues that arise in spiritual emergencies and stuff like that. People not eating, people not taking care of themselves, etc. So, there's definitely safety concerns too.
I had a friend in my undergrad who had to be hospitalized against his will. Wasn't eating. I think he was eating wild herbs and or acid every single day at really high doses, disturbing class and all this stuff. And he had to go back. He had to go get hospitalized for a little while, and it was actually really helpful. He had no real complaints about it. I had a lot of questions when he got back to school. But then, more recently, I've had some friends report back after participating in some of these clinical trials, and the referrals they received for therapists who they could work with did none of this work under insurance, so it's highly inaccessible. So even if we have these people trained, they're not necessarily doing this work under insurance coverage or with insurance coverage. So only the elite can really get it, unfortunately. If you're middle class in America or Europe, you're kind of elite, right? Like, it's no doubt. So that leaves a huge amount of people who just can't touch this stuff, even if they were part of a clinical trial or, went on a last-ditch effort to go to a retreat somewhere.
Yeah.
A lot of problems here. How do we resolve it? We just keep talking about it and seeing if we can come up with ways to support it and make it work, right? Yeah. So I really like these low-cost kind of like mental health farm co-op models where you can go be a worker, have a nice place to live, like work as much as you're able to, but still have lots of time for like decompression and being in nature and all this kind of nice stuff. And you do this in Iowa and Oklahoma, Kansas, like land is not super duper expensive, so you might be able to pull it off at a pretty affordable rate. There might be other countries too, like where can we help people just post up for a while so they can heal?
Yeah.
Right? Because often this stuff self-resolves. That's the point of spiritual emergence. Often it self-resolves when supported appropriately.
Yeah, you just need that container at times for people to go through it. And, sometimes it can last months, right? And it's not always a quick process. And I think that's where it becomes an issue, especially in our world where cost comes into place, right? Like, how do people afford to live at a place for a couple months, if insurance isn't covering it? And, that's definitely the big hurdle here, I believe. But, also really important, I think this is coming up again from that conversation that we were having. And we've brought this up on the podcast, quite a few times, but, visioning the future when psychedelics start, obviously more and more people are doing them, but when they do start to become more mainstream, and more and more people are engaging in it, what type of safety nets are we creating? Right? What does the future look like here? We need to start kind of thinking ahead at times and thinking about people are having these really, big opening experiences. What type of new models can we form for people to maybe live in community for a little bit? It's really cool to be able to work at the Soteria House for about a year and getting that up and running, to just see a new way of operating. I know things have shifted since I've been there, but it was a really cool experience just to be part of, to really focus on that community, peer-led, peer support type of approach. It wasn't covered by insurance, but it was fully funded by the state at the time. Not too sure what the deal is right now. But
so people weren't paying out of pocket, right?
No,
it was a way to lower costs of people being in hospitals full time, right?
Yep, exactly. So it was, hopefully saving the state money, millions of dollars, by not having people hospitalized, but living in a residential home where they're receiving peer support. So it's, not paying medical professionals and, that rate. Just seeing seeing people move through it. And I've just been seeing a lot of people asking recently about, I have somebody that had is in a spiritual emergence process after a psychedelic experience. Is there anywhere we can send them? And I don't know of too many places. I know there's a spiritual emergence center, and I think it's outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I'm not too familiar with their work, but I know it's there. And there's only really a few places where you could go. But I would love to see kind of more of these types of models emerge and just figure out the economics around it to make it sustainable, make it affordable and accessible. What happens when people start opening up and we don't have the systems in place to properly support people? I think it gets worse, right? I always kind of come back to this term from, again, Arnold Mindell, the city shadow. This whole book was kind of covering psychosis and just saying people that are suffering with that, they're really kind of representing the shadow of the city. People have these experiences and then the city is pushing them to the outside, right? We don't know how to deal with this. We can't deal with this. So, get out of the inner circle here in the city. You got to live on the outskirts.
Right. Yeah, so maybe that's something we should think more seriously about in a few months, Kyle, once we get a little more space, because this space is accelerating so quickly that and we haven't been able to deliver real kind of tryptamine, phenethylamine experiences at high doses, right? Excluding MDMA. But, real hallucinogens, real psychedelics. We haven't been able to deliver those at a high enough volume to really, really see the need. The ayahuasca thing, thankfully, is kind of pay-gated because you have to fly so far, for the most part. But, there are those people having a lot of problems in even the ayahuasca landscape. And how do we address it? Because we're going to see so many more people eating psychedelics. And if you look at the scene in California, there's so many people are treating it just like it's cannabis. It's just whatever, but it's not the same. There needs to be more education. We need more people kind of understanding how we want to relate to this stuff.
Well, that's an interesting thing. How do we relate to it, right? So it brings up a conversation I had a while ago with somebody, and they were saying that, the tribe that they were with down, I forget if it was in Brazil or Peru, but they said they would only drink ayahuasca when they really needed to, because going into that realm had had consequences in their external world. And that was a really interesting thing to hear, where they had this relationship with this medicine because the world that they were engaging in, was coming back into the physical reality as well. And it's how often do you want to engage in that, right? What is the purpose of engaging in that? And, for some, it feels fun and it's kind of like a carnival ride. Other times there's this other type of experience where, again, we're, contacting ancestors, we're contacting other beings. And what does that do to our physical reality? Kind of that's definitely a transpersonal thought, and kind of, we could throw the air quotes around there, woo-woo at times. But, for some people, that's a real thing, right?
At the very least, a real experience that they've had. What the actuality of it is a different animal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is such a deep and good angle. A while ago, Erik Davis, the writer, philosopher, I really like Erik.
I do too.
He wrote Technosis, and what was the other one recently?
High Weirdness.
High Weirdness, amazing book. So he wrote a thing about there being a thread of mysticism in the Grateful Dead world, and I absolutely agree. A lot of the lyrics can be, mystically oriented. Get this, wake up to see that you are the eyes of the world. Of course. And, people are doing pretty high dose LSD, so things are happening. You are having on occasion, this isn't everybody, and it's not even everybody over the course of their whole career, right? But it's on occasion you'll have these awakenings. You know, given the right conditions, you have this awakening, and then all of a sudden you're a mystic inside this weird scene. I've seen similar things in the fish world, you know, somewhat pragmatic materialist people, and now they're, you know, doing energy work and yoga and whatever else, and helping people to the, you know, their focus is helping people, which is really interesting. It's never really the kind of a decadent mysticism I'm interested in, which is weird, but that's me, I guess. But you know, go ahead.
No, you can finish.
Yeah, it's all decadent mysticism. I thought that was a funny phrase.
Yeah. Well, just your comment there of like somebody kind of very material then going to say like healing energy. I mean, what kind of cultural impact does that have at times, right? I mean, and I think, you know, sometimes you see this, especially with like, say, like therapists and doctors starting to get more involved in psychedelics, and then all of a sudden being open to this new way of being and seeing the world. Now all of a sudden, you know, maybe they've left their medical career to pursue more kind of like healing arts. You know, I guess what type of perception does that paint around psychedelics and how it changes our mind, or, you know, and is there fear around that too, of like, you know, what does that do to the hardcore scientist or medical expert? Now all of a sudden they're believing energy and, you know, trying to operate much differently. You know, is that, like devalidate like, the experience, like, this is kind of like woo woo, or like what's going on all of a sudden, or is some of that truthful, right? Like actually having a new way of seeing the world, interacting with the world, having a new relationship with the world, and is that valid?
So we've got a podcast with Dr. Matt Brown, who I think we're talking to tomorrow, which is great. Nice. But we had this thing a while ago where he wanted to explain this notion of energy from an osteopathic medicine framework, because that school of medicine kind of has that. So we really discussed it in an interesting way. And there's other systems that talk about energy too, right? Chinese and Indian schools. Yeah. I'm sure there's plenty of African schools that talk about this. Various indigenous North American, South American, Central American cultures talk about this. Like I've had a really interesting energy session years and years and years ago with a Mayan shaman. It's really, really interesting. You know, what do I do with that? I have no idea, but at least I had the experience, and I have more fodder, you know, for my vision of reality, right? I think that's the idea. You just like accumulate fodder for your vision of reality. So these things all go together, right? Healing, the transpersonal world, and spiritual emergence. Like, spiritual emergence is the more gentle version, right? And then spiritual emergency is when somebody's actually like possibly at risk of getting hurt, or ruining relationships, all this kind of stuff. Spiritual emergence is a little more gentle, but it's still not all that comfortable.
No, yeah, the way that I see it is that, like, you know, when I was going through my spiritual emergence, I was pretty functional, right? I was still getting my degree. I was able to work. But internally, I mean, there is a big process unfolding, grappling with like all sorts of different questions and insights, and, you know, feeling like, what is going on? Trying to keep my feet on the ground, trying to walk between two worlds at times. Yeah, whereas like that spiritual emergency, you know, people might need a level of care, right? They might need support in a different way if they're not taking care of their needs, right? Maybe they're not eating. Maybe they can't show up to work because they're just so overwhelmed by the energy that they're feeling. I'm just, you know, thinking about a couple people I've worked with in the past, not being able to work because all of a sudden they're super uncomfortable with the energy that they're feeling, or, you know, all of a sudden they've stopped eating because, you know, just energetically, food felt really, really strange all of a sudden. or, they maybe have some insights that they want to like do a long fast, right? It's like trying to balance your energy in that way.
Right, kind of spontaneous impulses that don't really seem to come from anywhere specific, and those can be disruptive. I can't say they're bad or good, right? But it's the experience somebody has, and like, should we let them do that? How should we let them do it? Should we have special facilities and supervisors for it? Probably. But we should just have a lot more psycho ed around this. Because of the drug war, we've got so much misinformation on all psychedelics, all drugs, really. And we've got a long way to go to educate folks about what can happen, what does happen, and what should we, and what can we be doing.
Yeah, these are things that we're going to need to think about as this field progresses and move forward.
Right. A friend I was talking about earlier talked about all these other changes that happen in clinical trials, and found a researcher attached to a major university that said, well, I have seen some pretty dramatic relationship changes outside of healing in these folks that have gone through the trial. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And how do we prep people for that? Like, are you going to be able to stay with your wife after you've seen God 2 or 3 times in session? Are you going to be able to share that relationship appropriately with your primary partner?
Yeah, or what happens when somebody has like a strike of insight like that and they realize they don't want to be in that, or like, they kind of get this like soul purpose, life purpose kind of insight, download, whatever you want to call it, and all of a sudden they want to make radical change in their life.
Right.
How do you support that? I mean, that's so disrupting to systems, just relationships, right? And that's scary for a lot of people, obviously. I mean, any sort of disruption within a system is terrifying to the system, because then what happens? The system has to kind of redefine itself and figure out, take on new roles and responsibilities. But, I think this is like the disrupting aspect of psychedelics. Sometimes they do disrupt our lives, our relationships, our work, everything. And so, it's also a good question to ask yourself, like, when's a good time to take some of this? Take a psychedelic. Timing can be really important. There's been times where I've backed off on a lot of inner work just because I knew I needed to keep my feet on the ground for a bit. Because I've already had, I was already having like these deep kind of insights bubbling up, telling me to create change. And I'm like, wait, I just need to like get through grad school right now. There's so many parts of myself saying, no, it doesn't matter. Just, don't do it. There's other things to worry about. And, but the deeper part of me is like, no, this is important. And like, I could let those other thoughts kind of consume me. And who knows, maybe if I did have a big experience, I would believe in that a little bit more and just give up on, that goal that I set for myself. So yeah, I think it's also important to check in. I'm sure somebody would be like, well, you're bypassing that work. Maybe that's not your life goal, is to complete that goal. But if you're already having those thoughts of wanting to not do that, but I think that's normal, right? People kind of set goals and you're trying to deal with the expectations of reality and what's purposeful. But then when you have maybe these bigger transpersonal insights, some of that stuff just goes out the window. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter. Like, I can kind of go do whatever I want. And I had plenty of that thinking after my near-death experience. And maybe that's where, my insight comes from, is like having a lot of that like grandiose type of thinking after my brush with death, and then also being met with earthly expectations, which is one of the challenges of integrating psychedelic experiences and spiritually transformative experiences. Dealing with those earthly expectations, like, oh yes, like if I want a career in this field, to become a therapist, well, yeah, grad school is an earthly expectation that you need to deal with. Just because the transpersonal tells you nothing matters, it's all connected, go do whatever you want. Well, yeah, we also live in this reality too, and it's important.
Mm-hmm. Right. Cool. So I think we beat this one up pretty good. I think we could go on for days talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
But, healing. Yeah. What is healing? It's like returning to a good state, a desirable state, I guess, that's like long-term sustainable. And then, the transpersonal, it's beyond the personal biographical. Could be anything, there's so many things it could be. And then spiritual emergence. Yeah. Material coming up that's radically transformational, and an emergency is when that same material comes up and it's a really difficult change, possibly dangers coming up. So we've got a lot to look at here and a lot to agree on about what is our direction. Where do we want to go? Why do we want to go there? Do we exclusively want to take on ancient traditions? Do we want to develop new hybrid traditions? That's kind of what I vote for. But, where do we want to go? How do we want to get there? Do we have consensus on values? I don't think we do yet in this space. This is really funny definition of consensus I heard the other day, Kyle. Consensus is when a group of people mutually agree to say what they don't believe. It's like, okay, that's fascinating. And something to keep in mind. Like, are you compromising what you actually think just to get along in a group? Sometimes you need to.
Yeah.
Sometimes you really need to. Like, you can wholeheartedly disagree with Monsanto, for instance, and, still need to buy food from them, for a lot of reasons, right? Food that was in their pipeline, right? Like, not from Monsanto.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot here. A lot of gold to mine.
Yeah. A lot of questions to ask.
Think about this. Talk about it with your friends. I think it's a really important series of conversations. If you're in religion, it's easy. Like, you've got the religion, but how do you relate to the people that aren't in your religion or might not see eye to eye with you in that religious movement?
Yeah.
Like, what are some things we can do to at least allow for each other to do what we want to do, right?
Yep.
Because I'm sure doctors or the DEA or FDA are going to come for psychedelic religions at some point. I think we're pretty well protected, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some battles left. You're eating these scheduled substances.
Yeah, hopefully not.
You're a criminal. Yeah, I think they're, I think they're going to have some trouble with it, but, let's hope we're going to be fine. Yeah. So just be ready, team up, make some alliances, right? When we can't all agree on things, we've got to come up with at least a few things we can collaborate on. Like, let's not talk down about each other, all the time, right? Let's maybe try to build each other up and see what kind of change we can make. Yeah.
So important. It's a good place to, I guess, wrap up on. I see that we're coming up on the hour there.
So September 23, Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists kicks off again. You can learn more at psychedelicstoday.com. It's an 8-week program, and it's just an amazing foundations course. Check it out at the very least. Email us if you have any questions or hit us up on socials. We've also got the Australian cohort kicking off hopefully in October, and more dates on that when that gets released.
Yeah, and then also have some other courses in the pipeline as well. So be sure to stay tuned, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And then, I'm excited to get some of these courses out with the Ketamine and Trauma series and another course.
Do you have a tentative date for that one? I forget if I've asked you.
Hopefully mid-October. Hopefully beginning of October. Yeah, so we're getting it. All the interviews are done. Now it's just production and editing and getting it all put together. So stay tuned, everybody. We will have that available very shortly. I think it's going to be a really great resource for therapists that are doing ketamine work or just starting to enter into the ketamine space. A lot of great conversations. I think there's around 12 interviews with people using ketamine and really specifically talking about trauma. It's been kind of a complex topic to navigate, so I'm glad that we were able to really create this container to explore the topic a little bit more in depth and hopefully advance the conversation.
Yep, absolutely. That's what it's all about. Getting together, talking about it, learning, and progressing. Yeah. So, cyclical process. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Solidarity Friday with Kyle and Joe. This is us signing off. Breckenridge, Colorado, Hackettstown, New Jersey. We'll catch you all on the next episode.
Take care, everybody.